Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. My name is Douglas Gabriel, also known as Thomas Paine in the ass of the Globalist, and today we are going to kick the ass of Andrew Marshall, the one that is called Yoda, but I would rather call the evil emperor. And I'm here today with the person who people are clamoring to have us back on the show, and that is with Michael McKibben. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be back.
It's been a moment because you've been out there doing all kinds of interesting things, but we had to have a conversation with you so that we could give a eulogy to the warlord of warlords, Andrew Marshall, the head of the Office of Net Assessment, a man who, since about 1944, worked with Henry Kissinger to create the entire nuclear deterrent program, but at the same time, in 1944, was very consciously stealing every single patent, claiming it for national security purposes, stealing it from the person who invented it, and bringing it into a group that later was formalized and called the Highlands Forum and then later the Highlands Group. And he headed that, but before that he was the head of an office that James Schlesinger set up when they came out of the Rand Corporation, a think tank that was trying to look into the future 20 to 30 years to build the weapons that would be used for net assessment. Net assessment means how many people will die on each side in relationship to the weapons that you are using for that war. He has been the author of that. He has been the person who created a network of venture capital support of stolen, weaponized patents from our office, patent office. But he also worked with the Brits and made sure that the Brits and the entire international world also built these weapons at the same time, because that's what he and Henry Kissinger decided would be the foreign policy of America, a deterrent, always building the most advanced weapons from stolen patents, but then making sure the other side has the same weapons so that you can continue to build more weapons. Michael, I know you have a lot to say about this, so that's my opening, but take it away.
Well, it's been a long 30 days, and what we've been doing as a team is we have been dramatically updating the timeline, the crime line of evidence that has been gathered. It's been coming out at such a rate that the timeline had got a little stale. So it's better now. There's more information going in. But we've had to essentially build a whole new wing on this museum, because the information that is coming now almost every day from researchers all over the planet is starting to bring into focus the long history of what you just summarized, Douglas. And what we're seeing now is the extent to which those that we have trusted to govern our countries have been totally selling us out. And I never quite understood why patents were such a focus for them. But now that's becoming clear. And as you'll recall, we were some of the first people to really dig into the events that were occurring in South Africa and Britain prior to World War I, and the activities of Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner, John Buchan, who later became governor of Canada, by the way, and the kind of vision that they had for our world. And their vision is really what has driven this. And they had the original vision for what they called the New World Order. In other words, a new way of managing the world and its resources and its people. And it's so easy with this story, since we're talking 100 years here, it's so easy to get bogged down in a rabbit hole. And in a sense, that's what's been occurring over these years of us and our team digging into these different activities that these people were involved in, because they've had a 100-year jump on us. And I think what's happening now is we've been digging and mining to the point now we are seeing the connections underground of all of these various storylines. And now a picture is coming into focus, which is quite, in one sense, quite encouraging, because we think that we're starting to see all the interconnections and all the relationships that have been driving the agendas that we have been looking at. And keep in mind, our reason for doing this originally was to figure out why our patent was stolen and why the U.S. Supreme Court would not protect our patent rights according to the U.S. Constitution. And so that was the driver. And in fact, patents are the only property right actually written into the U.S. Constitution. So the irony of this is just amazing. But bottom line is, the other day, someone sent a document to us, and I had never seen it, and as it turns out, the document's been out there, but nobody ever talks about it. And it's a document that Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed on December 7th of 1942. And the title of this document, it's an executive order, essentially, to create something called the Office of Alien Property Custodian in Washington, D.C. And I'm not joking. This is a real government document. This is coming out of the patent room at a library in Boston Public Library. But this document is authorizing this office in Washington, D.C. to steal, to confiscate over 50,000 patents, which they, in their document, say representing some of the finest research achievements of modern science, particularly in production of dyestuffs, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and electrical goods. And you read this article, you read this document, and it's a mixture of propaganda words, why we're doing it, which is basically to protect the peace of the U.S., which always seems to be their excuse. And then it's a feeding frenzy. They actually have a list, many pages long, of patents in different areas that the American government was managing the giveaway of to American and British and Commonwealth corporations. So, call me crazy, but I think this may be the reason for World War II. That the reason for World War II is to create a global crisis so that this group of Anglophiles, American, British, and Commonwealth, would have a big enough excuse, a 9/11 type excuse, to actually steal the creative resources, the intellectual resources of the rest of the world and give them to American companies. And if this doesn't define fascism, I don't know what does. So we created Hitler as this whipping boy, and then our government went and achieved something that you could argue is 100 times Hitler, in the way that we stole the intellectual property rights of people around the world. Now, this was not only in the Axis, formal members of the Axis, this was even in the occupied territories of the Axis. They would actually steal the patents of patent holders. And so this document was in 1942. In 43, if you'll recall, was the year that the U.S. Supreme Court acted and invalidated all of Marconi's claims to wireless technology and essentially said those were all Tesla's technologies. Well, that appears to be when they then created such a feeding frenzy around wireless technology that allowed American companies to come in, like AT&T, like all the telcos of the time, Bell, to steal those technologies without having to pay any of the patent holders. And this is following in the 30s when the Farnsworth TV patents were similarly absconded by various legal machinations. So what we now see is the end result of that. We were, all of us who were in our 50s, 60s, 70s, grew up in this age where our economy, the economy we grew up in, was fed by this massive, gargantuan theft of patents from all over the world. And so then what happened more recently is we saw Sir Geoffrey Patty in the UK in the 70s and 80s form Serco. He formed the British Intellectual Property Law Institute and then proceeded to take control of the British patents. And then magically in the 2000 time frame, 2005 time frame, we saw Serco move into the U.S. and now actually manages our patent office, the U.S. Patent Office, a British company. So we've seen this whole patent theft. Now we see a continuity from the Marconi patents in 1883 forward, and then now we see the current state of affairs being that the federal government, the U.S. federal government, has given a contract to a British company to steal our entire intellectual property, and they're getting away with it. And nobody in Washington is saying a damn thing. Excuse my French.
Well, you can use whatever language you want because it's exactly right, and you should be mad about it because this happened to you. And when we met, you had noticed in our research Highland Forum, Highland Group.
Right.
And that is Andrew Marshall. But before that, Andrew Marshall, from 1944, the exact time period you're talking about, because Andrew Marshall came out of Rand Corporation with James Schlesinger, who became Secretary of State, and people like Herman Kahn, who founded the Hudson Institute, and Daniel Ellsberg, who put out the Pentagon Papers. These were the major think tank people with Rand Corporation. And when they entered into the government, they basically took it over. Because what they said was they were the policy makers, they were the policy analysts who could look into the future. And when we look into the future, you have to be able to do a net assessment of what will happen from a grotesque interactions, war, and then what will be the net assessment. So when James Schlesinger set up the Office of Net Assessment, it was, in fact, Andrew Marshall who had that job, who took that job and kept it up until just a few years ago when he retired. He's now...
And he was a founding member of the Senior Executive Service in 1978 in the Office of Net Assessment. So by 78, the SES was paying him.
Oh, yes, and the Highlands Forum was only formalized much later, after he had been doing all of this work pretty much himself, just him and a few people. And the people he trained, the very people you mentioned, the neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Cheney, the whole group, he trained them. And what did he train them in?
Earl.
Yes, he trained them in weaponizing patents and then distributing them to our enemies to make sure that the military-industrial complex goes on.
Can I stop you for a minute? One of the things I didn't mention about this march through the last 100 years was, I think it's important. It was important for me to understand the motivations of these guys and why they haven't really changed for 100 years. What we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s was Cecil Rhodes was creating something he called a manifesto for a one-world government, which first became the League of Nations, then it became the United Nations, and is carrying on now within the United Nations. Well, one of the things that he specifically was looking to do was essentially reform the way the British economy worked, because they were quickly losing all of their colonies to what they called home rule. And one of the things they were working very hard to do was figure out how to essentially fool these colonies into thinking they were getting home rule while the British were continuing to control the resources of these colonies. Mining resources, copper, rare earth minerals, uranium, iron ore. They needed that, and they were trying to figure out how to do it. So this was one of the evil geniuses of Cecil Rhodes, is he figured out that the new model for the British Empire should be something called British federalism, where they essentially would vest all of the controls of the British Empire in a string of global British corporations that would manage the resources of these organizations, manage the resources of these companies, while continuing to maintain this notion of the superior benefit of the British way of thinking on how the world should be governed. And so, consequently, what they discovered in the Tesla patents, which they then stole and gave them to Marconi, is they learned that these intellectual property assets were much more valuable to them in the long term than their mining assets, than their natural resource assets. And so they actually consciously started working on how to fuse their control of the world media, to control what people think, with their banking interests, where they could drive markets up and down and create wars in order to sustain this very evil vision of the future. And they haven't changed that. That's what they're doing now. This issue of patents is the new type of mining resource. It's intellectual property. And that's the fusion with what we have discovered about our circumstance, is that our invention of social networking was essential to them for their propaganda, for their control of communications, for their control of the way people think, and also to be able to drive markets up and down by false flags. And so nothing's changed for 100 years.
Except that it's become so institutionalized. I'm going to describe that institution here in America, but I want to underscore what you just said. These are always British-controlled entities in America. For instance, when we're talking about the military-industrial complex and the largest military contractors, let's look at Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin has a golden share. A golden share is nothing more than a monopoly. It's the controlling interest in any company. So our number one contractor is controlled by the Queen because she owns the golden share. And so you bet your bottom dollar that Andrew Marshall knew all of this every time he created weapons. Now, in the old days, the weapons were created through DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency. So these inventions, including DARPANet, which became the Internet, those were driven by the Department of Defense. Now, they simply, before we met you, we found out that they simply steal the patent from anybody they want, and if that inventor gives them a hard time, they kill them. We literally listed 125...
There's a more sophisticated version of that, but go ahead and finish your thought, and then I'll talk about that.
Yeah, inventors are in danger if they turn in their patents to the patent office to try to get them patent, because if they can be used as a weapon, they are taken legally, because we found there, when we looked into this, we said, how is it that there's 5,000 patents, 3,000 to 5,000 patents a year stolen by the patent office from inventors every year in America? How is this possible? So then we looked into it, and we literally posted 125 names of people who have been killed that we know were directly killed because they were inventors who tried to say, hey, you can't do this. And if you speak up, you go to jail. So once they steal your patent, there is a law that you're not even allowed to talk about it. Now, you didn't get caught up in that. You were caught up in them stealing it before, at all levels. And so yours was a little bit different. But in general, we have people calling us all the time who say, will you interview us? They stole our patent. Who's they? Well, the patent office. Why? Is it military? Right. Yes. Well, that's going to be what happens. So that's DARPA.
Okay. So they developed another mechanism, and it involves the banks. It involves the moneyed interests who are behind this weaponization, and they obviously make the money from the wars. And it's called the venture capital system. And that venture capital system is, and by the way, the guy who was the chairman of the National Venture Capital System Association in 2004 was James W. Breyer, who became magically the first chairman of Facebook. Anyway, I digress. The venture capital system is something I have a lot of familiarity with, because when I was first starting to raise money to do our project, I would talk to venture capitalists a lot, local venture capitalists generally, and then it started expanding to regional and then national. And so one of the things that I noticed as an engineer, I started seeing a pattern. And that pattern was these venture capitalists are all singing out of the same hymnal. And I didn't know what that hymnal was, but they obviously did. But what I started seeing is a pattern in the types of feedback that me as I as an entrepreneur would get when I talked to these guys. And the first one is on valuation. Your valuation's too high. What's your idea? That was the first joke we had when we would start talking to venture capitalists. And then secondly, they would want all sorts of very detailed ideas about what you wanted to do or how you wanted to do it without protecting your intellectual property. They were very resistant to signing non-disclosure agreements, and now we know why. But the bottom line is the venture capital system is a very clever system for talking to inventors who are generally not that business savvy. That's not always true, but they assume it is, and so they basically will beat you down as an entrepreneur and tell you you don't know this about business and you don't know that about accounting and you don't know this about law, and you need us. And on one level that makes sense because those things are all true, but the other thing about inventors is they're all pretty quick studies. And so they don't have to be ignorant all the time unless they're being made ignorant. So consequently, the first offer, the first seed round of a venture capitalist is usually a small amount of money, 50, 100, 150, 200, whatever you need to get your idea moving. And there's always a deal that if you can get to your projections by the end of your first round, then you will have achieved your objective and you can move forward to a second and third and fourth round. But one of the things that's very clever is the way these guys build their subsequent rounds so that by the second or third round, the entrepreneurs lost control of their company. So they've gone below 50%, and the venture capitalists have moved in to take over, and then they move in their people. And the reason they do that is not because the entrepreneur's not savvy, generally. Sometimes that's true, but the main reason is so that control of the idea is basically seized by the banks by the second or third round. Very legal, very legally. And so consequently, the entrepreneur's lost any kind of control of his or her technology, and all of the big money goes to these banks. That's how they get away with it. Except with certain people, and I was one of those certain people that I had recognized this pattern. So when I started Leader, I basically went quiet. I went dark, and we built this in the dark. And so when we came out of the chute with what is now social networking, I'm sure they were all shocked because normally they will have heard of the idea and have figured out some way to finagle it away from the entrepreneur. That didn't happen with me, and I know other entrepreneurs it didn't happen to. It sounds like some of these people that were actually killed were in that group of people that resisted that. Well, there's a reason, because these guys they're inhuman. That's what we've seen now with this research in this last 100 years. People dying, 9/11, 500,000 Iraqi children. Those are all just collateral damage to these people because they've got a new world order to build. And how dare you get in the way? I want to stop there.
Andrew Marshall is responsible for more deaths than we can count. Now, let's go back to what you said before, and then I'm going to expand upon this institutionalized form that we have now of stealing patents underneath the guise of national security. And that's that after World War I, Charles Dawes controlled everything, including patents, all inventions, everything they learned during the war. And the Department of Defense, on all levels, were the greatest inventors of that time. Matter of fact, you can't count all the inventions that came out of the military by necessity during war. And they went directly to one man, Charles Dawes, and he controlled basically everything. The flow of oil, the flow of kerosene, the flow of food, the flow of information, everything. Same thing after World War II. One person controlled it. Edwin Pauley. He did the same exact thing that Dawes did after World War I. So then it became so institutionalized that by the time that good old Andrew Marshall got to the Office of Net Assessment out of coming from the warmongering think tank of Rand Corporation, they not only used DARPA, but then they made it, we started going cyber. So they started using In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is the CIA's research and development group. And they meet, the In-Q-Tel group and DARPA. Nowadays, it's unbelievable. You can look it up. Just put in the DARPA wish list. DARPA puts out a wish list of the weapons they wish to create for the next 10, 20 years. And anyone who can create anything like that then gets pulled into this venture capital institution that Michael was just describing. Infinite money and infinite no-bid contracts for companies that don't even exist. They get the contract.
That's the promise, as long as they can seize control from the entrepreneur.
Exactly. As long as they always have the back door, they always have the zero-day code, they always have everything built in for them as the weaponizers of it because it's military. Well, the In-Q-Tel got started for cyber warfare. Now cyber warfare, because we put so much of our commerce onto the internet, is as big as any other type of warfare that ever existed. So DARPA and In-Q-Tel work together in the Highlands Forum, Chatham House rules. In other words, nothing can be written down. You cannot state who's in the meeting. It's all basically hidden. It's insider trading. It's international, by the way, and it feeds the companies. For instance, I mentioned Lockheed. Lockheed has their cyber group that's called L3, and they recently, they were the largest in the world, the largest intelligence agency in the world working in America is actually the golden key, the golden share is owned by the Queen. So L3 was bought recently back again by Leidos. So out of In-Q-Tel, Leidos and SAIC are private corporations who get told that they're going to have military contracts, no bid military contracts, because they were the first ones to maybe get the project going. And instead of having a patent, they simply get venture capital investment, which is guaranteed. And they literally can open their doors with valuations of billions of dollars. Because why? They have multi-billion-dollar contracts with the government. So,
well, that's the key. That's the key to investors in the early rounds of a deal having their what they call exit strategy. In other words, you buy the stock cheap, you go through a bunch of funding rounds, you get to the point where you've given contracts to these multinational companies where you create this huge story. All the PR people from the propaganda media go to town, pitch it. So the hapless outside investor thinks, well, this must be a good deal. So they all buy in. The valuation goes through the roof, and all those early investors pull out. They get all their cash out, and they just keep doing that. That's the mill we're in.
And you saw that with Facebook. They were
Yeah.
the most egregious. You might explain that a little bit to people because.
Well, I mean, one of the ways that they pumped the early valuation of Facebook was they brought in a bunch of money from the former Soviet Union through Yuri Milner and Alisher Usmanov, and they invest. Nobody knows for sure exactly how much they invested, but it was a massive amount of cash. And the timing of that is very interesting because of things that were going on here with something called the America Invents Act, which after Obama came to power, David Capos, who used to be at IBM, and a couple of other people rewrote the laws on our patent laws to make it very easy for these multinational corporations to attack patent holders with something called patent reexaminations, which are in fact a legal way to continually harass a patent holder until that person's run out of money and can't continue protecting the patent. And we actually experienced some of that in our deal as well. So they've created all these mechanisms to, quote, legally attack and steal and take whatever they want, whenever they want. And it's all lawyers. It's all a war of attrition unless they need to steal it, which is what they did in our case. They just stole it. And I think the reason is they didn't want any paperwork to show that they had to buy the rights to this. They wanted to claim they had the rights. So it was stolen, given to IBM. IBM put their logo on it, republished it, which is illegal, and they were off to the races. So that's how important our invention was to their military-industrial propaganda effort. And Andrew Marshall was right in the middle of this. And let me go, you mentioned DARPA was the old way. We've just had a whistleblower come forward and talk to our team, which says that DARPA and the Highlands Group and Net Assessment were all the same group, Douglas.
Oh, yeah.
From the beginning.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that. When the Office of Net Assessment was created, it literally was the beginning of the Highlands Forum, though it wasn't named that. And
Right.
That was in 1944. And in 1944, you have Henry Kissinger. I won't bash him too bad, but let's just say that with the Council of Foreign Relations, he said there has to be a nuclear deterrent. So it was Andrew Marshall who led us into the nuclear age, insisting that we had to have 50,000, 100,000 missiles aimed at each other. And then what happened? China got the missile. Pakistan, India got the missile. Other places got the missiles. And China only has a few hundred. And so there is no such thing as the kind of insanity that led to this type of nuclear proliferation, which was simply the idea of Andrew Marshall taking his lead from Henry Kissinger. And now you see that before Andrew died, he wrote book after book after book about China. And he's talking about two things mostly. One is that we're going to go into a war with China or else we have to give up and China wins. Secondly, he wanted cyber tools, and that's why In-Q-Tel was involved, because that's the CIA. They wanted tools to be able to manipulate people's behavior through the internet. And this is what he actually wrote on. Now imagine, he made also wish lists of the weapons that he wanted. And these weapons now are not just weapons to blow up and kill people. They're not just things like, EMFs and 5G, which can actually kill people, stop people, make their brains feel like they're on fire. Active denial, it's called. He's the inventor of every single weapon in the modern age, okay? And he's a mass murderer, and his dark black heart is going to feed the demons in hell for a long time to come, because I cannot think of a single person who was responsible for more death than him. And he had a heart murmur, so he didn't fight in the war. And, people, recently we heard some people really criticizing him, but it is amazing that we met someone who was in the room with him, and that person said,
Correct.
He's just got cold eyes. He doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, everybody listens, because basically this man is the evil emperor. He's called Yoda, but he is not Yoda, not in any sense of the word. This is an evil killer who is too much of a coward to ever enter into a battlefield. But he invented spectrum warfare. He invented all of this stuff. And
well, when you say invented, he didn't invent it, he stole it.
Well, that's what I mean. He came up with the
Right,
idea,
okay.
then he found patents that linked with it, stole the patents, killed people if he needed to, used our money, taxpayer money, Department of Defense money, CIA money, all NSA money.
Senior Executive Service.
And he worked with probably only senior executive service members, because why? They're all militaristic. They consider themselves generals, and they're in charge of each of the different agencies, the federal agencies.
Well,
so, yes.
As far as we can tell, the Senior Executive Service is nothing more than a copy of the Crown agents out of London and the Privy Council. That's our version of the Crown agents. And as far as we can tell, they take their orders from the Crown, from the Privy Council. And the other reason that we took notice of Andrew Marshall so much after you pointed him out to us was that we started seeing an exact parallel of activities that he was doing with what our former patent attorney, James P. Chandler III, was doing. And what this whistleblower confirmed from firsthand experience is that Chandler directed Marshall. Now that
yeah.
is amazing.
Yes, that
We've
is
got
shocking.
these two closet, shadowy figures who are making the decisions on who lives and who dies in this world.
And we have direct first-hand knowledge that Chandler was in some of these meetings and he was in control. Anyone that he wanted to be, he was 100% in control of that meeting and nobody questioned him. Matter of fact,
we asked this person, okay, you were in the meeting, Marshall was there, Chandler was there, who was taking orders from whom? And this person said, obviously, Chandler was driving.
Yes, now we have to make sure to give the evil emperor, Andrew Marshall, his due, because really, when it comes down to it, I do not like Adnan Kasaji, one of the largest arms dealers in the world, or the bigger arms dealer than him, which is Hillary Clinton, because she, of course, did more arms dealing as a Secretary of State than any Secretary of State ever did before in history. But the largest arms dealer in the world is Andrew Marshall, because when he invites you to a Highlands, used to be called Forum, Highlands group, personal invitation, you can't come otherwise. It's insider trading, so he's going to tell you about, let's say, hypersonic missiles, and then he's going to tell you, because Raytheon will be there, their representatives, but also British Airways, BAE will be there, Lockheed Martin will be there, as well as
pharmaceuticals, media companies, educational outfit, universities. It was the go-to fascist group of America. I mean, There's no other way. This defines fascism. When the government has teamed up with certain companies that are going to get all the contracts, that's fascism.
And what really upsets me is those companies are owned by Britain. Yeah. Literally, the Queen owns Lockheed Martin. How is that possible? How is that possible? Because she's our friend?
It's a convoluted structure of intertwined relationships where you've got to spend a lot of time going through all of their paperwork to figure out where the controls really are.
Basically, through our research with you and your amazing researchers and teams and Betsy's team and everybody, and all the people that send stuff to us, what we found out is there is nowhere where money flows that the British government, the United Kingdom, the Privy Council, the Queen, the monarchy, let's call it the monarchy of Britain, is taxing us. They've set up the Crown agents. They set up...
I think that the reason this happens, Douglas, is because from Cecil Rhodes' day forward, they always wanted the U.S. back in their orbit, and they were very critical of King George for letting us go. And so what they started working on back in the day was a way for the Privy Council to get back in control of what they lost in 1776. And that's what they've been working on. And they've got a much... For people who are organizing conspiracy, the monarchy in Britain is a much better mechanism for hiding your activities than doing it in the U.S. So what they did is they drive it all from London. This is my opinion. They drive it all from London, and they couch it using lawyers in ways that make it look on the surface to be to be a republic, but in fact is nothing but corporate fascism.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you look at what they've done, it's always the same old routine, because the paths of evil that lead to hell, the 7 deadly sins, are very easy to predict. So what did they do at first? Well, you got Cecil Rhodes, stole the gold, brought it back to the city of London, and let the Rothschilds control the gold and silver market and literally set the value of gold and silver twice a day for I don't know how long, a long, long time. And then, of course, at the same time, they set up the Rothschilds, once that worked nicely, got control of the diamond mines and the entire diamond flow of the world through De Beers.
Yeah, Cecil Rhodes was the first chairman of De Beers.
And then, through Rio Tinto and some really wicked dealings of the Queen, she got control of basically the resources of the world, which included uranium.
By the way, Alfred Milner was a director of Rio Tinto back in the turn of the last century.
And I'm sure he did a good job to steal all the resources he could from all of the Commonwealth nations, which is...
Milner appears to be the one of the catalysts for the assassination of the Tsar in Russia. So these guys, Milner, Buchan, and Rhodes, appear to be three drivers of the current system. And for whatever reason, and probably the control of gold and diamonds, they've been able to keep control, along with the Rothschilds, to this day.
We never needed uranium to drive nuclear power plants. We never needed any missiles. We never needed any nuclear missiles, okay? We never needed any of it. But it's the Queen who owns the uranium. We saw that with the Uranium One scandal and the big battle for uranium control here in America, and us idiots who allow nuclear power plants to go on when they can be replaced by thorium power plants, completely retrofitted without any problems. None of those missiles have been used. As a matter of fact, they've been dismantled, and Putin and the Russian gang sold that uranium, downgraded it, brought it to America, and sold it to us before we even took care of the uranium that we had in our missiles. Our missiles are still sitting there waiting to be downgraded and to be taken apart, and we have now given that over to a company, which is a Russian company. So they're going to come over and, again, handle all of our uranium. So our supposed enemy, right? So uranium then became the big control thing. And then what happened? Then in 1914, when they faked that Marconi invented the wireless and they stole it from Tesla, they knew immediately that this would be the next field that they would have to monopolize. And so they did. And they monopolized everything electronic and every communication device until they could control all elections by their propaganda, whether it be news or wireless or radio or television. And then it went into the cyber warfare. And now we're beyond cyber warfare because we let the Chinese into every single aspect of everything cyber in America, and we lost the battle. And we're just now trying to clean it up and get rid of it because Trump has taken over. But the big issue was world currency. Who led that? That was the Brits. They wanted a world currency based upon the climate accords, which is based upon your carbon footprint. They were going to tax you and literally tax you for how much carbon you were using in your house, even if you never left. This was to be the new currency that was a tax beyond all British taxes. Remember, the Brits are the king and queens of taxing. So gold, diamonds, uranium, elections, cyber warfare, and a world government controlled by a world currency has always been a consistent plan of the evil of the Brits to keep control and to destabilize the whole world so that there's a clash of nations below them. And as you pointed out, the Anglo-American alliance would be above. And we would, of course, control the currency, and we control the gold and diamonds, and we control the uranium and all the nuclear, and we would control what people think. And that's why Andrew Marshall was so set on begging on his DARPA wish list and his In-Q-Tel wish list. He would say, tell me more ways to control people electronically, subliminally, without them knowing, because he knew that this was the new battlefield. It is your mind. It is the information that you take in. It is what you do with it. And he wanted to control the whole world. And so there's a whole lot of interest also, Michael, now, and we need to join with some people who want to do talks about Richard C. Walker's Internet of Things, because what we call the Internet of Things, which is really aggressive remote control of all things, everything,
right.
Alive or dead, it doesn't matter whether it's a bus or a train or a plane or a car, does not matter. The Brits and the people working with them to steal patents and to control the world through intellectual property need to control everybody, and that's what Dragonfly is about. That's what is happening on Facebook and Google.
We've given Serco control of our naval warfare. This person, this whistleblower, confirmed everything that we've discovered with firsthand knowledge. They want to control. Serco is running our naval warfare out in Washington D.C. This person confirmed that.
And this person has
we've
more
seen
experience.
The contract, so it's not like it's secret.
Right. She has more experience than anybody I've ever talked to, from satellites to defensive systems, but all defensive systems as a contractor, because they allow these contractors to bop around and they don't just stay in one silo. And so that's how come you have people who can whistleblow on the whole spectrum. But anyway, she could, as you say, confirm so many things that I have yet to be able to digest it. So we need to do some research and some intelligence reports, because the things that she revealed were shocking, because in some cases we were asking, we think this is true? And she would say, oh yeah, I was there and this and that, and then give us all the details. So
right.
it's amazing to think we actually have spoken with someone who sat across the table from Andrew Marshall and and Dick O'Neill, who was in charge for a while, and now James Baker, a different James Baker than
Chandler.
the one, you know, and
James Chandler,
and all these people. She sat across the table from them
and
was able to give us an analysis.
One more we're supposed to add to that list, and that is Anthony J. Tether.
Oh yeah,
director of DARPA.
Yes, the current director of DARPA.
So there's 4 people on that list. Andrew W. on the short list for the control of the Highlands Group. Andrew W. Marshall, James P. Chandler, Richard P. O'Neill, and Anthony J. Tether.
Tether replaced a woman who went over to Magnavox, because Google said that they're not going to create warrior robots. Oh, no, because, you know, they don't do evil. So they simply own Magnavox, and Magnavox is creating the, what do they call that particular robot? Anyway, I think they call him Adam. But
the Atlas Warrior?
That's it. The Atlas Warrior, created by Magnavox, was really created by Google, which is created, of course, by Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt, one of the people who put up hundreds of millions of dollars for Facebook before, as it got started, and then was, set up to be able to withdraw it quickly. So he went from being a mega millionaire to a mega billionaire simply because of insider trading coming from this exact group we're talking about, Highland Forum, Highland Group, whatever you want to call it.
Well, one of the things these guys are obviously counting on is that they've got all the cash, and so they can keep these stories spinning and keep most people in the dark. And most people come home at night, have maybe 15, 20 minutes of news, and that's all they get for the day, and so they can keep most of the public in the dark. What we see happening now is the patriot community is getting so large now that the dots are being connected. The jigsaw puzzle is taking shape, and the more we see this and have it confirmed, the more disgusting this is, that these human beings would choose to treat their fellow man in such heinous ways. It's so disrespectful to the image of God that's implanted on every human being. They don't respect life. They're heavily investing in certain types of pharmaceuticals where we now know there are viruses, microviruses being hidden in vaccines that can be triggered by various kinds of electronic signals. I mean, we're not kidding.
When you talk 5G, you might as well say, Andrew Marshall, when you talk microwave diffuse control of human beings, you might as well say Andrew Marshall. All I can say...
And imagine a nanobot stuck in a vaccine, and that nanobot is just waiting for a certain signal from a 5G device. Yes. I mean, that's how unbelievably evil these people are. We've got to stop them now.
Well, they've weaponized food, air. They have 5G transmitters in space beaming down on Africa, doing experiments on Africans. And then you start to see all these illnesses and all these crazy things going on in Africa where literally people are turning into zombies. I mean, the exact description of a zombie. Why is that? Well, that would be the experimentation going on. And so the experimentation comes directly out of this group. And this group wants to say that they're not part of the Department of Defense. They're not part of DARPA or InQtel or LIDOS or SAIC or L3. No. They're independent. They just casually get together to plan the demise of the world. That's all. Why should we be worried about this group?
Well, here's the problem, Douglas. Marshall's name is all over the plum books ever since 1978. He's listed every time until 2016. So he can't hide the fact that this is coming out of the Department of Defense Office of Net Assessment. This is no way. That's publicly recognized data. Now, he's organizing meetings between the Department of Defense, a public agency, and selected private companies to have these meetings. Well, obviously they don't want notes for it because it's all treasonous. You're not allowed to do that. You're supposed to have, when you work with the government, you've got to have competitive bidding. That's the theory. But in fact, this group for the last 50, 60 years has been meeting in secret. This is the definition of fascism. We have a fascist government right now. We have fascist warlord organizations.
Absolutely. This is part of the shadow government. And remember, the decisions made in those meetings of the Highland Group, the Highland Forum, are the largest amount of money spent on anything in human friggin' history. And guess what? They will spend trillions on the planes through Lockheed Martin and BAE and Boeing and all these different military-industrial complex corporations. And guess what? Trillions of dollars come up missing. Trillions of dollars.
We fought fascism in World War II, and we became 100 times more fascist. It's just astounding how immoral and inhuman it is as we're discovering what these people have done.
It truly is. And Michael, we want to thank you for talking to us today about patents, patent theft, Andrew Marshall. And I say good riddance to Andrew Marshall. I'm glad that you're no longer on the face of the earth making decisions to kill people at your whim, with your capricious attitude that is completely hidden in the British way, the Chatham House rules, the insider rules, where it's internationalism. He was no friend of America. Absolutely, he was a treasonous, seditious, murdering person who was a criminal of the world. He is an international criminal. Now, most people don't know he existed. Most people don't know this group existed. You can look all your life and not find this group. We are some of the few people who will ever tell you this group exists, but it's a fact. It's history. We have the history, plus we have direct experience of people.
First-hand knowledge. First-hand evidence to verify everything that we've said.
And you also have Dr. Pachenik, who recently did a video. He knew Andrew Marshall very well, and he says the same thing that we're saying, that he was a heartless, cruel, murdering coward who basically was the most powerful man that there was, period.
Well, let me quote you. I just saw Steve Pachenik's video a couple of hours ago, and one of our team members is making a transcript of this. It's a pretty short video. His closing remarks was that Andrew W. Marshall was a coward and a tyrant.
Amen. And I don't know, I feel like he needs much worse names thrown at him. But just think about it, folks. Everybody who died since 1944 in a war was calculated as a statistic by Andrew Marshall. And he predicted ahead of time how many would die by that engagement. And remember, most of those wars were false flags that this group itself, through international agreement, set up many of these wars for the sake of profit. So this is the grossest warlord, warmongering, profiteer, and basically one of the most evil people that has ever existed in history. And they like to just consider him to be Yoda. Just a nice
the Washington
Jedi.
Post and the New York Times, they're all singing his praises right now in the eulogies.
It's disturbing.
And that's what I think ticked off Steve Pachenik so much, and he came on the video and says, no.
Extreme media, the more they claim someone was a hero like John McCain, the closer you should look to find out that he was the exact opposite. So again, Michael, thank you for being on the show today, and
You're
you
welcome.
for bringing
Great to be back.
This grotesque, dark, demonic group, the Highlands Forum, into the light so that they can be disinfected, and that the scum that still work in this group still work against Americans to this very day.